Let's welcome Brandon, who can talk about the facade of NgRx Facades. So please welcome Brandon. Brandon is a GDE, Google Developer Expert in Angular and web technologies, right?
Yep.
Also, core NgRx team.
Yep.
One of the original ones, and also thank you.
OG, as they say.
Yeah. Thank you, Brandon. So let's listen up to Brandon.
Yep. So the facade of NgRx Facades. Thank you for having me, by the way. So let's start out with the question. You're here to hear about facades. Should you use facades with NgRx? Let's just get into it right from the jump. Yeah, you can definitely use facades. I'm telling you right now, go ahead and go for it. Okay, maybe not. It may be a little more complicated than that, and we'll talk about it. Of course, my name is Brandon Roberts. You can find me on Twitter at Brandon T. Roberts. I tweet out funny gifs. I talk about sports, and I block people sometimes because that's what you have to do on Twitter, right? I'm a senior software engineer at Narwhal. I'll give the pitch again in a minute. Also a GDE, as Alex mentioned, and also a member of the maintainer and core member of the NgRx on the NgRx project, which is building reactive libraries for Angular. So here we go. I work at Narwhal. It's an enterprise consulting firm where we includes an awesome team of talented engineers that helps companies build large apps at scale using monorepos and proven development practices pioneered at Google, Microsoft, and Facebook. So you saw it before. Of course, we're hiring. So come talk to us. If you want to talk about NgRx, we can help you with that, or monorepos, or just good practices in general. There you go. So let's get back to it. Should you use facades? I like to think of facades as they're like the cilantro you put on like a burrito. Some people like facades. They think it tastes great. Some people think it tastes like soap. So what are facades really before we get into that? So if we take a look at a store where component first, we can see we're reading state from the store, and that component is talking to the component's talking to the store, and then it's notifying the store of changes. It's getting that data from the store using a selector. You use store.select, which is pretty straightforward. And it's also expressing interesting, unique events by dispatching actions. So we look at this from the component point of view. We have a books page component, and it's doing, like I said, mentioned those few things there. We're reading state from the store using a selector. So here we're just selecting, assigning a string for your selectors for the books. And when we want to dispatch an event, we're taking that book and dispatching that action to the store to make a change. In the template, we bind to these variables using the async pipe, because that's pretty standard practice. And we call methods in the component class to use event bindings to bind to these events, like click events to select a book. So nothing fancy going on there. So let's introduce the facade pattern. So before, as you can see here, we had the component, and it was interacting directly with the store as far as reading state and notifying of changes. A facade adds an additional layer or an abstraction in front of that component, so the component itself isn't aware of NgRx, isn't aware of the machinery. So a facade is a simple service. So we create that service. It looks like this. It still has an injectable. If we compare that to the properties in the component, the facade has one or more properties that are selecting state from the store. There are also methods defined in the facade that dispatch actions underneath. Here we call this method to select a book, and we're passing that data needed by the action to that function. The component calls this method and is unaware of what's going on underneath. Going back to the normal component, now we can simplify this interaction with the store. So before we had the store, we had these methods that were training these events, and we're simplifying that with the facade, right? Pretty nice. In the component template, where we're using these properties that we define in the component, now we can access the facade directly there and use the methods on the facade directly in the component. Now you can decide for yourself if that's a good thing to do, linking it this way in the component, but it provides you that option. So facades offer an abstraction layer between the component and layer in NgRx. My friend Lucas Rubicki says he is relentless about making components as thin as possible. Facades are popular in other places. So really, should you use facades with NgRx? They seem pretty simple. Let's talk about go into Storytime real quick. So I used to work for a game studio in the U.S. Army where we developed websites for like marketing material. We didn't teach kids how to like build bombs or anything like that. It's pretty straightforward stuff. Because as you can see, as I'm pointing in the picture, I am not a soldier, and my friend Mike here is definitely a soldier. Actually, he's not, but I like to tease him about that. So we started building apps there using AngularJS, and then eventually we became the lead engineers on a big social media app rewrite that was written in AngularJS. So it's a big project. It was like, we're going to jump right into it. And you know what happens when you get to a big project, right? It's like, yeah, we can do that. But this is me underneath, right? Architecting your first big app. So me, my friend Mike, and a couple rest of the team, we said we're going to do it. We're going to go out. We're going to build this app. So ideally, you might have seen this before. You have a lot of these services that come in your Angular application that you're building up. We have this wild dependency graph of services and controllers. And then you start putting those pieces together. This service is talking to that service. Oh, this service needs to talk to that service. And it becomes this beautiful system, right? That looks great. And the good part about it is we finished it. That app is still used and in production to this day. It's launched, and it could sound like a success story, but there's an alternative side to that as well. We launched the app, but it hadn't been updated since we launched that app 4 or 5 years ago now. Because you know what happens when you move on to a new job and that old code base is sitting there? Yep, that's what happens. Dust those hands off and go out the door. But this application left a trail of issues behind, right? The application was seriously hard to debug. We had hard to find race conditions in HTTP requests, no clear assignments of responsibilities, and bad promise-based code. It was hard to trace data changes, where data came from, how it got changed was a mystery, and bringing a new developer, oh, it's good times. And of course, there's not nearly enough unit tests because it's a big app, we're new to it, so we're too busy cranking out code. So we make the code base became brittle and hard to change. So what happened is we turned this app, we introduced something called spaghettification. We introduced spaghettification into this app. Because we were well intended on what we started to do. From a glance, the spaghetti looks good. Or from afar off, it looks good. But once you drill in, that doesn't look very appetizing at all, right? You start looking closer to it, and it's not so tasty. So what we really needed to do, and that's not cilantro, is make a lasagna out of Angular and not fall into the same pitfalls that we did with AngularJS. So NgRx is a product of the things that we learned building that, some of those things that we learned there, integrating those into NgRx. So what we needed at the time was a smart layered approach to building these highly interactive Angular applications. So like I said, we wanted to make lasagna out of Angular. So let's look at some of the responsibilities that we had before, or that we were using before, or even that are done in Angular today. Here we have this search movies page component, and it's doing a few things. It's passing data around, we're binding to these movies, and we're setting that property in our component. We're talking to services, where we're going out and hitting some API, and then updating that property in the component itself. And we're also changing that data as a result, subscribing to that observable and updating the movies. So then we get to these responsibilities of the component that it has, passing data around, talking to services, and changing data. But we flipped those things around with NgRx, and we sidestepped those problems that we had using indirection and performance. Or we gain through indirection, and we gain performance there. So how do we do that? Indirection and performance. So let's talk about that. So what is indirection? Before we have a component and a service, the component is talking directly to the service, makes some calls, gets some data, and is very direct in that way. Indirection is putting a middleman in between the component and the service. Instead of the component talking directly to the service, it talks to the dispatcher, and it has no knowledge of what happens after that. The component and the service are no longer coupled to each other. So you can change the mechanics of the component around or the service and still do those things without impacting each other. Another way we can look at it is through waiters and chefs, because we've all been to a restaurant, right? You go into the restaurant, and I don't know about you, but have you ever gone to a restaurant and just go in and take the chef and wear his hat and go make the food yourself, right? You just go directly into the back? Of course not. Indirection is you go into the restaurant, you talk to the waiter or waitress, and you put in an order, and some amount of time later, you get your food back. It's indirect. So what we've done here through this indirection, now we can separate those responsibility into isolated modules of code. We have reducers, which George talked about earlier, where we're changing data through pure functions. In the component where we were talking directly to the service before, now we're using effects or side effects to isolate that interaction there. And the components are using selectors to get data. And so we have that indirection with these actions. The other part of it is performance with selectors. And selectors are the way that you get data out of the store. So the indirection saved us, like I said, from the spaghettification, which I don't even know if that's a real word or not. Somebody, a friend told it to be, that were introduced in our code base. So being able to isolate those things, we were able to focus on performance and ensure a great user experience for our users in this real-time interactive app. So now we circle back around to facades. So why are facades in NgRx a problem? Facades threaten to undermine that indirection, or why are they so controversial? Because they threaten to undermine that, from our point of view, undermine the indirection of actions and the performance of selectors. So actions are many things. You may have, if you follow me on Twitter or me and Mike, you may have heard them called the gluten in the NgRx loaf or the melty ricotta in the NgRx lasagna. I like to call them like the little burnt crust that you break off and throw away. There are many things, but actions describe unique events. And that's one of the foundations of NgRx. Here we have some actions that define different interactions that are coming from the user, like favoriting a book, or interactions with the API, where we're getting that result back. Getting back the result, we're declaring these intents or events of things that happen in our application. So then we have our reducer. We have a books reducer here, and reducers take these actions and decide how state changes. So we're delegating that responsibility to the reducers. Same with effects. We dispatch actions, one action that can be handled by many effects, and effects decide when to call services. So those are the things that these foundation pieces that actions are built on when using NgRx. So if we go back to the books page component, and we replace that with the facade, so back to facade, we're still encapsulating how the selectors work and how the actions work. But there's a subtle issue here in looking at this facade that I've seen in the wild that has gotten people, couple of things that have gotten people in trouble with them. One thing is wrapping the store.dispatch in your facade and wrapping each one of those in the facade itself. So the problem that comes up is it gives you an easy opportunity to reuse these actions. So if you have this facade, then you say, well, I can just take advantage of DI. You have the books facade, I can use it in the books page, details page, or the inventory page. And then you'll be encouraged, if you have that same action that you want to trigger somewhere else, you will reuse that facade, that method in that facade to dispatch. Well, as I mentioned before, actions should be unique and they shouldn't be reused. So facades encourage action reuse and take away that the responsibility of effects and reducers in that decision-making power, so that the component, you're putting that responsibility back in the component. Selectors are one of my favorite parts of NgRx. I call them the real secret sauce. And selectors are like database queries. We treat NgRx store like a table like a database that has tables in it. Here we're using the store. We have different sets of data, auth, books, authors, and covers. And we use selectors to get that data out of the store. So here's just a pretty simple covers facade. They're selecting a dictionary of covers from the store. But the other issue is how will we combine this data, how we combine data from two facades, or combine data from two selectors. So naturally, the natural approach is to use something like combine latest, an RxJS operator, to get both books and the covers dictionary. But there's some subtle differences in there. If we're using the selector here, combine latest combine latest combines both of these observable streams. So inside this map function, if I update one of them by itself and then update the other one, everything's okay. But if I update both of them at the same time, how many times do you think it's going to trigger an update based on the behavior of combine latest? Well, you're going to get two emissions, because if I update books and the covers at the same time, covers dictionary at the same time, the first derivation is run, but we really don't care about that one. It's just immediately discarded. It causes garbage collection to run again. And if you can, or looking at that at a grander scope, if we're using combine latest with 4 or 5 of these streams and we're updating these simultaneously, then you're going to run into performance issues there because we're triggering unnecessary redraws in your UI. So what we want to do is use create selector in that same scenario. Both of those pieces of data are in the state already, or multiple pieces of state are there. So if you have those pieces of data, reach for create selector first, because even if we update books even if we update books and the covers at the same time, we're only going to get one emission because it runs over the entire state. Selectors run over the entire state when combining data. So that's part of the hesitation that we've had with using facades with NgRx. As you can see here, as another example, I'm combining latest to select some books, and then I'm using another facade to select the covers. And then there's that, then later down the road, I could add another stream there, and then I'm running those in multiple times based on how many streams I have. So facades can expose an API that can be too powerful or result in poor performance in code. And another way to say it is they're like a foot gun that you're not aware of when you start using them in the beginning. But we don't want foot guns, right? So how can we use facades if you decide to use them in NgRx without spaghettifying your code base and not running into that same trap that we did before? The way to do that is to implement this interface, with a facade interface, which you're dispatching in action. You can still define your selectors within your facade, but you're keeping your actions close to where they're being dispatched from. And this will allow you to avoid reusing those actions and reusing those actions and keeping them unique to the places where they come from. The other part is only inject a story into your facade. We mentioned, I showed the slide before where you're injecting facades into other facades, and then you end up back with that beautiful system as it was back then, but it was a mess of services. And then you could run into like circular dependencies. I've seen that also. So only inject a store into the facade and use it that way. So now, looking at the facade now, we're using the selectors to combine data before exposing them here, and then using the action so that we're not robbing the reducers and effects of the decision-making responsibilities and getting the best value out of that. So we're limiting the capabilities of the facade to promote best practices with NgRx. So, because we want to, if you're using it, we want you to get the most value out of it. Because NgRx prescribes an architecture that you can use when managing state in your application. But be careful, make sure you take the time to understand how NgRx works before you reach for the facade and add additional abstractions on top of it. This will help you get the most value out of it when using NgRx. So lastly, we're not going to talk about cilantro or any more lasagna or spaghettification. Instead of eat spaghetti, eat more lasagna. Thank you. But wait, there's more. I got one more thing, and this is a exclusive from AngularToronto. NgRx Conf is coming next year. We had a lot of requests for this conference, and I'll say it up front, it's not just going to be the NgRx. This is a reactive Angular conference that we're holding next year, and here's more information about it. 2 days, speakers, 200 attendees at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center, November 5th and 6th, 2020. Be sure to come out. We'll have more information about it soon, and we hope to see you there. If you want to go to the website, conf.ngrx.io, and thank you for having me.
Yay! This is really exciting news that we were holding it off until AngularToronto. So you heard it here first.
It earlier. Heard it here first.
You heard it here first. Today will probably be all over Twitter. And
there you go. So tweet out NgRxConf 2020.
AngularToronto.
AngularToronto. Y'all should have been here. Those people who aren't, there you go.
Thanks a lot, Brandon.